We are live. Welcome to Thursday Night Live Reality Check. I've got my panel of experts tonight. How you guys doing?
Doing
Doing
great.
great.
All is well.
Good to see everybody. Tonight's topic, I think, is an important topic, and it's how to heal from a divorce, a breakup, and other traumas. Now, I think that I have always said that probably the most frequent entrance ticket to the manosphere or men's content is through trauma. And probably it's through a breakup or a divorce. So I think that is probably the number one reason why men enter men's content and the manosphere. So we have a breakup, we have divorce. There's also other types of trauma. So if anyone wants to add to this, that's great. I think loss of a loved one is a major trauma in someone's life. It could be your parents. It could be your wife, your husband, somebody close to you, a friend. It could be losing a job, losing your life support. I mean, basically, how you support your family. That's major trauma. There's also a couple other ones, like a physical ailment, as far as, say, cancer, or our military people come over from the Middle East, lose an arm or a leg. Now think about that. That's a trauma that somebody has to deal with. There's a couple others that I thought of. One is getting older. This is probably something that most people don't think about. That can be a trauma for some people, especially if you're in failing health or you're not taking care of yourself, or you're watching, say, your spouse fail in health or get older. Another one would possibly be anger and rage. That's a trauma to the system. An angry person, somebody who's enraged all the time. So I think those are some basic traumas that people go through, men and women, and it affects everybody, I think, differently. I'm sure all you guys have heard of, I think it's the Kubler-Ross model. It's these 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think those all obviously go hand in hand. So when you're going through a trauma, I think those 5 things really are important to recognize when you're going through that. So is there any other types of trauma that anyone on the panel could add?
Oh, yeah. But Pat is the expert. I'm not a dating coach or coach, so let Pat go.
Yeah, well, I mean, some that come up actually relatively commonly in my practice, stuff that happens in the childhood period, which then, you get traumatized, and the way trauma works is that you get traumatized by somebody, and then that leaves you open to being traumatized further by other people. And then it creates a pattern where very often you'll seek out your own, seek out trauma, basically, because that's how you start to associate it with connection. You see this a lot, for instance, with girls who, heavily promiscuous or date guys who treat them terribly. It's like a trauma loop for them. But where does that stuff start? Sexual abuse happens very often with sexual abuse in childhood. Sometimes it's more just physical or emotional abuse. I know that the manosphere will joke from time to time about bullying, and I understand that in a reaction to the perceived weakness of guys today, that maybe we need to bully kids more. But bullying can be really destructive, especially if it's ongoing. The guys I've worked with who have been seriously bullied, some of them are, it takes a lot to bring them back together, basically, because they'll block out whole periods of time, and their whole orientation towards other people, they are basically shut down. They put themselves last. And you mentioned rage and anger, Tony. Well, a lot of times it all comes as a result of trauma where their needs are just never met when they're younger. So yeah. And, BPD as well, not just necessarily with a woman you've dated, but actually having a mother who has BPD or some other serious mental illness.
For
heard some.
somebody that doesn't know what BPD is, what does that stand for?
Borderline personality disorder, and that's really awful because I mean, you know, you take any of the stuff that people in the manosphere talk about, like the dark side of women, and it's like amplify that by 10.
Mm-hmm.
It's just extremely toxic. They're always manipulating you, always gaslighting you, always criticizing you. But sometimes if they want something from you, then they'll be very sweet and seductive, and so it will just flip on a dime like that. So, but yeah, I agree, Tony. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of trauma, and you know, I think what is the famous Tolstoy quote? I'm going to butcher it, but it's every happy family is happy in the same way, and every unhappy family is unhappy in a different way. And so it's that there's many ways to be traumatized, but healing trauma all looks more or less the same at the end of the day.
How about Gonzo or Man or Tony Johnson? Any other types of trauma you guys can add to this?
Yeah, I can piggyback on. You guys hear me?
Yep.
I can piggyback on Pat. So number one, I have a couple books with me, but one of my favorites I found in 2020, The Body Keeps a Score. This is by a clinical psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk. He lives in America, but I think he's from Germany or something. I think he lives up in Michigan or I don't know, something like that. Great dude. I invited him to speak last year too, but I haven't heard back from him yet. I'll invite him again this year too. So number one, I would piggyback on what Pat said and up the ante a little bit. And I don't think that anger and trauma anger and rage are a form of trauma. At best, they would be symptoms of trauma. They might even be like a response mechanism to defend yourself, like fight or flight, freeze, fawn. Anger and rage could be used to defend yourself in a positive sense. So in general, I'm not on the anti-anger bandwagon. I do think anger can be destructive, though, obviously. You can destroy yourself, you can destroy a family, you can destroy a lot of things with anger that are not good to destroy. On the other hand, of course, anger can be used positively to defend yourself, for example. But also, Pat mentioned childhood trauma. That's the main thing I wanted to mention was childhood trauma. This book in particular, one of the reasons I brought it on here, The Body Keeps a Score, it makes the argument that childhood trauma, I'm not the author, but if I'm understanding it correctly, childhood trauma is particularly insidious because it happens when your brain is still developing. And if you go through a combat zone and you get your leg blown off or you watch your friend die at 29 years old, your brain is pretty much done developing by that point, and your personality. Your formative years are long behind you by that point. You still might have a long life ahead of you that you need to live through and deal with. But basically, when that trauma happens to you, you're an adult and you can deal with it and comprehend it and process it. Or your ability to do so is probably vastly greater than a 10-year-old. Or a 5-year-old, or a 3-year-old, or a 12-year-old, or whatever. So that's what childhood trauma is. It's happening and occurring in a human being who's not fully formed yet, not even close. They haven't even hit puberty yet, if they're like 8 years old or something. So they still have a lot of brain development, personality development to go through. And that trauma, severe trauma that young can cause lifelong problems that are very difficult to overcome. And typically what you would call this is CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as opposed to PTSD you might hear about in the movies and stuff, which, by the way, was not recognized for a long time. It was rejected like a pseudoscience and like nonsense. It used to be called shell shock and these other terms back in the day. Until finally, somewhere along the way, they finally recognized it. And this author, that doctor, has been trying to get CPTSD added to the DSM-5 and all that stuff since like 1991. So, 30 years now or something like that about. And he's gotten close at a couple points, all these stupid bureaucratic things he has to go through. But for different reasons, it's difficult to get done. And above all, it seems to be that these pharmaceutical companies, they prefer to have this wide variety of ailments to prescribe people with shit. And CPTSD is too much of a catch-all that would basically reduce profit for these companies with pills and shit. This is probably a story you've heard 1,000 other ways too, right, in the medical industry. Anyway, childhood trauma is very serious, and it's in a lot of ways the root, I think Pat would probably have some agreement on this, to relationship trauma that guys incur later in life with BPD women or even a bad breakup or whatever, in terms of how they're going to deal with that, how they're going to form attachments to women, and what kind of toxic relationships they're going to wind up in. I've been single now for 5 years since the Medusa experience with a BPD woman who might even be a psychopath by some standards. That was the argument I made back in the speech I gave on that issue. And to me, it's no surprise now that I ended up in that relationship. It was a matter of time before I found a woman who was toxic enough to get by whatever kind of defense mechanisms I had to avoid toxic girls like that. So it's just inevitable that I would end up with one like that. And it formed kind of an attachment trauma that I was used to in childhood, but in a way that I wasn't able to understand or observe. It was very covert, just like a covert narcissist as well, I would say. So those are kind of my thoughts on that. Childhood trauma is probably the most important type of trauma. It's the most serious, and it's the deepest, and it can cause the most damage because it's still happening in a young adult or a young human being who's not fully formed yet. And because of that, it creates like kind of echoes throughout the rest of your life if you don't deal with it. And these can be very hard. This is why the things Pat coaches about, shadow work and these things, I think a lot of cases that have to do with childhood trauma, from parents, siblings, being bullied in school or something, girls, fucking telling you to fuck off when you're like 13, 14 years old. You're very insecure and young at this age. You're very new to the world. You're still learning how everything works. So that's my two cents on it.
Okay. How about Gonzo or Gene?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Gonzo.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just gonna say, I think, and this is something that happened to me, right? Because when it comes to guys entering the manosphere, I think there's also another form of trauma that people enter in with, and that's realizing that they've been lied to. It's not so much even the lie, but like the actual lies themselves. It's the realization that you've not only been lied to by your parents, your teachers, your politicians, your public figures, like just anybody you can think of. If you've been lied to throughout your whole childhood, right, tying back to the childhood trauma, and then into even teenage years and adulthood, and then you wake up and you realize, wow, I've been lied to this whole time. I've been gaslit this whole time. That can be a huge event. So I think that happens a lot. That happens for a lot of guys who get into the red pill, I think, for sure.
How about Gene?
Yeah. Piggybacking off what Gonzo said, we're all traumatized. I don't care how perfect you think that, your upbringing was or whatever. You've been through some sort of trauma, emotional manipulation, whatever the case may be. The one thing about trauma that always sort of perplexes me is self-sabotaging behavior from people that, that are traumatized. It's very, very common. People tend to just don't know how to act when they got a good thing, and then they destroy it. And then, like Pat was saying, they repeat the loop of trauma. So that's something that's interesting to me, and it's got to be addressed. The trauma has to be addressed. No two ways about it.
What about symptoms of trauma? Okay, let's say, again, somebody's going through a divorce or a breakup. These symptoms that they have, the pain that they're in. What I want to make clear is that when you see somebody going through a tough time, I think when you're in a good place, it's hard to visualize sometimes or empathize with that person. But I think we need to know that their pain is real. It's real for them at that time. It's real for them. I mean, it's something that, again, it's something they're feeling. Okay, we know we try not to go by feelings or emotions, but this is what this man or this woman is feeling at the time. So their pain is real in their life. So they're going through a very, very difficult time. So I think some symptoms, like a guy going through a divorce or heartbreak, they liken the symptoms to like an addict going through withdrawals. And it manifests itself, or we'll even say magnetizes itself into physical. It can be your immune system. It can be loss of sleep. It can be a racing mind. It'll affect where you work. It'll affect everything in your life. Obviously, physical trauma, losing a limb or an illness, that's physical. Maybe that now goes into completely a mental trauma. So I think one will reverse to the other. So what are some symptoms of trauma, you guys? Pat, let's go with you.
Well, yeah, not breathing very much. I mean, anxiety is sort of, you could argue that's the more general symptom of it, but how is anxiety expressed? So men very often, but women will generally express anxiety through a kind of hysteria. So it's externalized, it's thrown outward. Not that there aren't areas that they're shut in as well, But men tend to, especially on a relationship level, tend to close up, tend to shut down. And so you'll see more of an avoidant pattern for men, but that avoidance is still anxiety. It's just how men tend to go inward with their feelings. And what happens is all the energy, I can get a little bit weird here, right? The energy of the trauma, you can look at trauma as it breaks through your barrier. And as a child, you maybe have a lot of energy, but you don't have any barrier created on your energy, which is why it's paramount for parents to protect children, and why it's such a crime to harm a child, because a child doesn't have a defense mechanism. You are harming an innocent being. You're really parasiting off, which is why very evil people love to do things to children. So once that has occurred and it's gone internal, then it creates all sorts of distortions within the individual. So clenching up their energy centers, which will reflect in their physical body. They might, you're going to see them usually stiff and more rigid, whereas people who are very relaxed, like you can see their bodies, they don't usually have a lot of trauma, or they process through a lot of their trauma. I would say that, things like stuttering, that's an area, because that's a derivative of anxiety. And of course, talking very fast. I mean, some people talk faster just because of the way that they express things. They have a lot of enthusiasm, maybe. But talking very fast and not being able to maintain eye contact while you're doing it, that's a sign that you feel like you can't connect with the other person, because if you were to do it, then maybe they would do something to you. I mean, there's all the things that we kind of identify though as creepy in guys, or awkward. Those are all indications of trauma. Inability to maintain eye contact, it's all trauma. So yeah, it's like you can tell pretty quickly that someone has trauma, but we don't usually think about that portion of it. We think like, oh, he's a strange guy, or it's kind of messed up, or whatever, and we'll tend to be a little bit judgmental, which is understandable to an extent, but generally it's like, well, we should probably think a little bit about, hey, what's going through this guy? Like whenever I go to conferences and I meet with some individuals, sometimes clients, you can see that they've had a lot of trauma, because there's like there's like an intimidation factor that's going on there. And I got nothing but love for these guys, and I think that you need to give those guys a lot of love, because it's, they maybe haven't had in their life somebody who would listen to them or treat them well, and so they've been kind of shoved off on their own. And as you guys have so aptly stated, it's in that state that people hopefully actually will find places like the Manosphere, which become these sort of virtual mentoring nets. Now, of course, there's negative aspects of that too, but I think it's a net positive overall.
Okay, let me welcome Michael Foster. Michael Foster, how you doing tonight?
Doing good. Glad to see you all. Hey, Pat, how you doing? How's that little baby doing?
She's actually in Poland right now.
Oh, shit.
Wow.
Just left yesterday. Yeah,
man, you're going hard on that trad thing, huh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I can't go anywhere. So,
yeah.
But it's good. I mean, this is the first time her family's going to see the baby, and so we're gonna, we'll see what the future brings. I mean, I think we all know everything's, even aside from personal aspects with it, everything's very much up in flux, and
very much.
Hey, maybe it'll be Miami. Who knows?
Oh God. Welcome. Yeah, Miami is almost like America. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Funny.
Yep.
Well, Michael Foster, I want to get your thoughts on it. We're talking about trauma, a breakup, a divorce, there's a lot of different things we thought of as like a physical ailment, a sickness, whether it be cancer, losing a loved one. So there's a big umbrella of trauma. And one of the things I want you to talk about too, like what Pat was just talking about, is the symptoms of trauma, and maybe how for guys to recognize when somebody close to them is going through something.
So my wife and I, we had a daughter die. I had three boys and I had a girl, Nicaea. She died, and it was the way I wrote a series of blog posts about it that actually I'm publishing as a book later this year, sort of next. But and they went viral, so I got a lot of attention, and it made us think through a lot of these issues related to trauma. And it was interesting to watch how she reacted and I reacted. I thought I might have lost my wife, right? She like went into a deep depression and almost psychosis at times, right? Like feeling guilty, like she caused the baby to die and looking for ways to save the baby when the baby was already dead. There was nothing that could be done, right? But for me, it shocked my system. And I always told people it was like getting my eyes dilated. If you ever had your eyes dilated, suddenly you can see all the light. Well, for the first time in many, many years, I started feeling emotion in a way I hadn't. And I can remember crying in the middle of a Macy's out of nowhere. Something triggered it. And I stuck my head like in the clothing like rack, right? Because it came out of nowhere, right? Like I'm not like that. It's not how I'm wired. And I stopped watching movies. I barely watch anything anymore. And I started to realize that the purpose of movies is for numb people to feel. They need they need the exaggerated horror, their exaggerated drama to like tap into feelings that they lost long ago. It's like older men when their taste buds are ruined, they're like doing all this hottest sauce they can find. Like I started to realize for me, like I was attracted to music and movies that would make me feel something. But when my daughter died, it was like God used it to reactivate a part of me that had been long dormant. And part of it is I'm a very intuitive person. I feel deeply when I'm in a room. I read people naturally. It's just I've been that way. And I was very sensitive as a child. And you got to protect a sensitive boy. You got to toughen him up the right way, or he'll either become effeminate or he'll become macho, or he'll become one of the two because he's got these feelings and he's feeling things and he needs to be in a protective sort of. He needs to have a really wise father. I didn't. My dad was an alcoholic. My dad was a gambling addict. My dad loved me, but he just didn't have the skills, the resources to raise children, to be quite honest. So what happened is as I went through my teens, I took on sort of tough guy, got arrested a lot, got expelled from school. The sort of like I hardened in a way that wasn't good. I was repressed. It was unhealthy. Right? Like guys shouldn't be crying all the time. I was talking to a bunch of ladies the other day. They were talking about how they hate how pastors cry. Like how pastors will cry in sermons. And these are women. They're like these woke red pill soccer moms. Like I hate it when pastors cry in sermons. I'm like, I do too. So I'm not talking about being emotional all the time, but having a normal range of emotion. So my daughter dies. I see her little white body covered in blood. And she looks just like her mama, and it does something to me, right? And it rolls out because men experience things differently than women do. Women experience things in a more full orb sense all at once, where a man processes it over time. We need to do that. That's why we can watch our buddy die, blow to pieces, while we're fighting a war and keep on moving forward and keep on shooting. When we get home, that crap's got a process though. And that's like PTSD with men. So men tend to delay their mourning and grieving of events, and it comes out in very unpredictable ways. So male mourning is tricky, right? It's very uneven, and it just kind of it can be delayed 6 months, a year, 2 years for a guy. So when my daughter died, it helped me emotionally heal. God can use tragedies in strange ways. It helped me emotionally heal and start to feel real pain. It was good, but in the process, when I wrote all those blog posts, I had all these people that reached out to me and were telling me about how they had a kid die. This one woman, I remember her. She had this son die 18 years ago in a car accident, and she said that she wrote him a letter every morning, and went to his grave every week. And I told her that was unhealthy. I was like, he's been dead 18 years. You know what I mean? That's not good. And what I started to realize, me and my wife saw this, that people were attracted to us because they were attracted to the trauma. We called them drama vampires.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we started to realize that these people had some pain in their back, some terrible thing that happened to them, real thing at some degree, that they won't let go of. They stew on. And you are a pathway for them back to that pain. And they get to like go over it. They get stuck on it, right? Like I heard Pat, I was listening while I was doing some work on the talk about kind of these loops people get in. It is very much a loop. It's a feedback loop they get into. And this one woman, she had her kid die about 6 months before our daughter died. And he just started bleeding from his mouth and eyes and died in a crib when he was like 3 years old. It was really strange. And she had been a missionary over in Russia and been exposed to some sort of chemical, and it probably was tied to that. Nonetheless,